light. James had been shunting trucks at the big station at the docks for several weeks. He hated it and complained longlessly to his long-suffering driver and fireman. Dirty trucks, dirty sidings. This is not suitable for a fine locomotive such as myself, grumbled James to his driver. Why can't the Fat Controller send Donald Douglas or Boko to do it? Stop your complaining, said his driver. You should be thankful for your hard work. You could be standing in an abandoned siding turning to rust. James's complaints finally subsided. I see your point, he said, but I've been working at the docks all day. Exactly, said his driver, which means you'll actually need a change of scenery, and indeed he did. Later, the Fat Controller came to see James at the yard. I've heard you need a change of scenery, I see, James, said the Fat Controller. James hoped the Fat Controller wouldn't be cross with him. You've worked so hard all week, he said, that you can finally deserve to do exactly the jobs you still always want, he said. Tomorrow we'll remark 70 years of our first written book, he said. I'd like you to give the clergymen a big welcome tomorrow at our celebration party, he said. Apparently Neville was to take the clergymen, but he's pretty occupied. Will you do that for me? Yes, sir, said James eagerly. I won't let you down. I know you won't, chuckled the Fat Controller as James smiled happily. Until later, it was dark when James arrived at the sheds, and he met the Fat Controller again, but with Hank, Emily, and Murdoch. The Fat Controller had finally gathered all of his engines for the announcement. Tomorrow will be the day we celebrate 70 years of our first book being written, he said. I need all of you to be busy and polite for the clergymen. They'll be taking pictures and filming you all still, he said, and the people there will be there at our railway, even the clergymen. What about the Fats one? Asked Emily, who gave Murdoch a big splash. Murdoch went red in the face and looked embarrassingly down at his buffers. The Fat Controller continued on. Neville was apparently going to take the clergymen to our railway, as I was telling James, but James will finally do that for Neville. Yes, sir, said James out loud. Very good, said the Fat Controller. Remember, I want you all to be on your best behaviour. The 4 engines both promised to be as good as gold. Soon the day finally came. The fat and thin clergymen were waiting at Farquhar Station when they heard James's whistle. James saw the 2 clergymen and the passengers and stopped eagerly at Farquhar Station. The passengers were enjoying themselves enormously when James eagerly blew his whistle. Get in quickly, please, he said with enthusiasm. And so the passengers did. They got into the coach, the guard blew his whistle, and James puffed excitedly up the hill. James was excited. He thought being famous makes him a splendid engine. So, I reckon they'll finally film me in the spotlight, boasted James. Well, we'll have to wait and see, said his driver, as James ran eagerly in and out of a tunnel and whooshed some steam away. At last, everything was going well. James had finally made it to the station docks where the clergymen were supposed to be at. Everyone came to admire James. "I'm a splendid engine," he said to them, and was very happy with himself. Later, James came back from the station to the sheds when he saw someone. There, in front of him, were the clergymen photographing and filming Hank, Emily, and Murdoch about since when they first started Sodor, while they were new to the island of Sodor. The clergymen and even the people that had never seen the three big engines before were impressed. But James was not happy. "This year we mark 70 years of our first book," he grunted. Not celebrating a few years after for these two young ones," he muttered crossly. Just then, Stepney bustled in. "What's going on, James?" he asked. "Those two big show-offs are being filmed and photographed instead of me," he said. "Well," said Stepney crossly, "it's their choice. You know," said Stepney, "you can't always be chosen by those that are that think is splendid," he said. James was cross. He thought the clergymen weren't taking any notice of him. When Stepney puffed away, James was still cross. "They should be filming and photographing me," he shouted. "Stop your complaining, James," shouted his driver. "It's just things the way they are," he said. "Now get used to it." James would get used to it, but he had a tricky plan. He blew a lot of steam to get the clergyman's attention. "What are you doing, James?" snapped his driver. "I'm trying to clean my smoke box," he said sarcastically, and indeed he was. The clergymen already walked over and found James. And when they found James, they were cross. His driver explained everything and then finished. Soon James was put in the sheds until further notice. He felt very miserable and had nothing to do for the rest of the day. Until later on, the fat and thin clergymen got the chance to go on the Celebration Express with 3 coaches. The 3 engines that were to pull it were Murdoch, Emily, and Hank, who is pulling at the front. The guard blew his whistle, and when everybody got in the express, the 3 were ready to go to show everybody around the sights of Sodor. They all liked the scenery and thought it was a very splendid sight. R.B. "Better look next time, James," said Hank. "Maybe it weren't really useful after all," he said as James watched the three big engines go take the express. James took no notice of the three big engines and covered himself in a thick cloud of white steam. And when they all came back to the station, all of the passengers gave all of the three best engines 3 cheers. The Fat Controller, who had been on the train, came to congratulate Hank, Emily and Murdoch. You three have done well, he said. You've shown them a fine piece of splendid sight RB, and you behaved very eagerly and politely. Thank you, sir, said Hank. Without us, the passengers would never enjoy the enthusiasm we've enjoyed today. Exactly, said the Fat Controller, and apologised to the three for James disrupting their interviews with the thin and flat clergymans. Soon the Fat Controller and all of the passengers gave 3 cheers for both Hank, Emily and Murdoch for being the most finest engines on the Fat Controller's railway. And indeed they were, even though they can think they were the best at times.